Good evening. Welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar featuring Sandra Steingraber and Bill McKibben. We're going to hear from a couple of local organizers before our featured speakers. My name is Martha Klein. I volunteer with Sierra Club Connecticut and am a founder of the Stop Project Maple Coalition. What I'm going to do very briefly is put a local frame on what we're going to be talking about tonight, methane pipelines and the future. So in the Northeast region generally, and in Connecticut in particular, the use and transport of frack gas, AKA natural gas, putting that in scare quotes, has increased enormously over the last 20 years. New England's electric grid is powered about 55% by burning methane and about 25% by nuclear. There's variation state by state, but overall, well more than half of our electricity comes from burning methane gas. The remainder is powered by large hydro in Canada, and only a fraction of our power is coming from truly renewable solar and wind. And like I said, there's state by state exception, and Mass happens to be an outlier because they're producing about 25% electricity with solar, but very much an outlier. And where is all this methane coming from? It's coming from Canada, from the US Gulf Coast, and from the Appalachian and mid-continent regions. Burning oil and coal for electricity has largely been replaced by burning frack gas, which is worse for the climate due to the extremely high global warming potential of methane, 100 times stronger than carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. Now, it was certainly correct to decrease the burning of coal and oil for electricity due to the direct harm to human health that causes. But unfortunately, burning frack gas is anything but low emitting, as the Environmental Protection Agency and other agencies erroneously call it. It's a fact that methane infrastructure leaks from the fracking fields to the distribution point at someone's stove or furnace in their house. These leaks are significant, and numerous studies using objective, verifiable top-down measurements have found that about 5% of all the gas in the system leaks into the environment. These proven scientific facts are denied by industry and government alike. Connecticut, in particular, is an energy giant. We export 20% of all the power generated in the state to New England and to New York. Connecticut has approved and or subsidized a great deal of new methane construction. 3 corporations, Enbridge, Kinder Morgan, and Berkshire Hathaway TC Energy, own the 591 miles of transmission or interstate pipeline that cross Connecticut, each of which has undergone multiple expansions or has expansion projects currently undergoing approval. Connecticut, we'll hear more about that in a bit. Connecticut has a law on the books, as yet unused, that allows for public funding of interstate pipeline construction. Other methane development in Connecticut includes the addition of 1,500 megawatts of frack gas power from new power plants in the last 10 to 15 years, and the addition of numerous frack gas powered fuel cells. Connecticut politicians forced ratepayers to bear the cost of an intrastate or distribution pipeline expansion, whereby tens of thousands of customers were connected to methane at ratepayer expense. This program was terminated after 10 years, but not before monopoly gas and electric companies Eversource and Iberdrola UI raked in huge profits. Other funds that the Connecticut legislature generously shifted from the public to the investor-owned utilities have included subsidies for gas-powered appliances, as well as making the public pay for gas leaks. We actually disincentivize gas distributors from repairing leaks by paying them for leaking. By enriching gas and electric monopolies and energy corporations, we've given them outside influence and power, which they've effectively used to block renewable energy, threatening our future. They've caused prices to spike for ratepayers. They pour fossil burning pollution into the air and continue to sicken and impoverish the most vulnerable communities. So now is the time for resistance. Now is the time to build collective intersectional people power, to demand a grid that stops killing the planet and the people, and to demand a grid powered by community-owned, locally sourced, and distributed renewable energy. So up next, we're going to hear from a local organizer, Nick Katkovich. And we have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. So just save your questions for the end.
Thanks, Martha. My name's Nick. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a campaign organizer with the Sierra Club. And I'm going to real briefly just share a bit about Project Maple. So in September 2023, Enbridge proposed Project Maple, which is a proposed expansion to their frack gas pipeline system that begins in New Jersey, cuts across New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and into Massachusetts, and then connects to other pipelines that bring gas into New Hampshire, into Maine. As Martha said, this pipeline system primarily brings gas from the fracking shale fields of West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania into the Northeast. We don't have full details about Project Maple yet, which I'll share more about in just a moment. But Enbridge said that the expansion could be as large as a 23% increase in the capacity of the pipeline system. If folks aren't familiar with Enbridge, they're a massive fossil fuel corporation, one of the biggest fossil fuel companies in the world. Traditionally, they were an oil company and have started buying into the US gas market in recent years. Enbridge is also known for unleashing violence against indigenous people. Folks ever heard of the Line 3 pipeline fight in northern Minnesota? Enbridge actually partnered with the police departments there to use violence against indigenous water protectors and protesters. As I mentioned, Project Maple was first proposed in September 2023. Thankfully, due to this large coordinated regional resistance with the Stop Project Maple coalition, Enbridge has still not filed any federal permit for the project. So we don't have full details yet. And one of the strategies of our coalition has been to really try to stay ahead of the game, not wait for those permits to drop, but really do all the work we can right now to pressure decision makers to oppose Project Maple. So although that's a success that they haven't moved forward with the larger proposal, unfortunately, Enbridge has done three smaller expansion projects under their existing federal permit. That included expanding or building a brand new metering station, a pipeline metering station, which regulates the flow of the gas in Coventry, Connecticut, expanding a metering station in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and doubling the size of of a pipeline under the Seconic River in Rhode Island. So we all fought these expansions, arguing that this was illegal segmentation. Enbridge should have been forced to apply for a brand new federal permit, but unfortunately, those smaller projects were completed. And Project Maple is actually bringing back a previous expansion that was stopped in 2017. So in 2017, there was a project proposed by Enbridge called Access Northeast, and that project was canceled thanks to fierce coordinated resistance across the pipeline route. So that's something we're trying to emulate with the Stop Project Maple coalition, and knowing that it's not going to just take one action or one strategy to stop this. It's going to take all of us taking action in the ways that we're able to take action. And we've already had some success. Just last week, we found out that a utility company in Massachusetts that originally signed up to purchase gas from Project Maple ditched the project after receiving community pressure. So we've stopped this pipeline expansion before, and we can stop it again. And just a couple other things I'd like to add. They say the fossil fuel industry will say this pipeline's to lower cost, but that's false. This pipeline, Project Maple, would be entirely paid for by ratepayers. So ratepayers would actually see an increase to their bills. Not only would the construction of Project Maple be paid for by ratepayers, but all the lobbying, all of Enbridge's lawyer fees would all be paid by ratepayers. So it's just not acceptable. We need to stop Project Maple, and excited for everyone to be here tonight. And hopefully y'all will join us in this fight. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Alicia to talk about a project in Hartford.
Hello, everyone. Um, Hi. My name is Alicia D. Jenkins. I am the campaign organizer for Sierra Club Connecticut, and I'm based out of Hartford. Um, I've been with Sierra Club for 4.5 years. It'll be 5 years this year. And I have been working on a lot of campaigns since the campaign I'm working on now in Sierra Club. I'm chapter staff, chapter campaign organizer. I don't work national. Um, the project I'm working on now is with our campaign called Building Electrification. And in that campaign, we are tasked as organizers to make sure that the buildings and that like residential areas or residential living spaces, housing, commercial buildings are updated to 100% renewable energy and are decarbonized. And we also organize around making sure that any new projects or any new buildings, any new housing, any new residential spaces are 100% renewable and are decarbonized. So the project I'm working on now in Hartford is dealing with the capital area system, which is located in Hartford. Hartford is as we know, the state capital of Connecticut. It is one of the largest cities in the state, and it has a population of 130,000 plus residents. Majority of the residents are Black American and Latinx, or mainly Puerto Rican. Um, and the capital area system is located on the south end of Hartford, which is predominantly Puerto Rican. It's been there since 1988. It heats and cools, and when it was at its highest peak, it electrified. It heated, cooled, and electrified more than a dozen buildings within the city of Hartford. Some of those buildings are the legislative building, the Capitol, where Deep resides, and amongst other buildings. And there are some private buildings that were heated, cooled, and electrified by capital area system when it was at its highest peak. And when it was doing that, it was using fossil fuels to do its dirty work, pun intended, because it was dirty work indeed. I have spoken to residents of the area about, about that. It looks like a cigarette. Like the kid, I've worked with kids around this project to have them like tell their stories about how it is to be living near this plant and near this energy building. And they say, Miss, it looks like a cigarette. And they see it and when it was at its highest peak, it was pumping out black smoke because it used fossil fuel. And we know for a fact that that toxic air waste is partially the reason, and or if not the full reason, why asthma rates are so high in that area. One of the reasons why the asthma rate in Hartford or in that area, which is the South End, is so high and was so high back in the 80s and 90s. So there are people now who have kids who are, they're millennials, and they have kids that are Gen Z, that are Gen Alpha, that have been suffering from air pollution for decades. So in 2022, the state of Connecticut purchased the building. They realized that the building needed to be updated because of old infrastructure and old appliances. So ever since then, Sierra Club Connecticut, me being the lead campaign organizer in this, have been putting the fire and bringing the heat to make sure that when they update, that update is 100% renewable, and that Hartford residents are not harmed in this update. In fact, that Hartford residents benefit not only from the clean air that we are looking to have it produce, but to also hire Hartford residents to do those jobs, because this is an economic thing as well. So, um, right now we have I have a team called my CAS team, my Capital Area System team. We have come together and we've hosted rallies, we've hosted marches, we have spoken to the governor, we've spoken to the mayor of Hartford. We just got a new mayor who's a millennial who basically grew up here. He went to high school here, so he knows about that. He doesn't know all the information about it, but he's aware of it. We have We've done webinars. We've spoken to the Department of Administrative Services who are in charge of making decisions about capital area system. We've spoken to the governor's office of operations and management about this because they also are decision makers. And we've also spoken to Eversource because Eversource did a pilot project in Framingham, Massachusetts around network geothermal and how they use that type of energy to heat and cool and save money for people who lived in that area. And we're hoping to get Eversource to do that here. Because Eversource is the number one private employer of Hartford residents. And a lot of those folk who are hired are Black and Puerto Rican or Black and Brown. So the way that this is in connection, it looks like because there was a study done in March of 2024 by the Department of Administrative Services, because they know they have to update it. And so they did a study about options that can be used to update. And some of those options are fossil fuel. And they looked at the cost, and the study favors choosing the fossil fuel because it's less expensive, quote unquote. Um, so we have been advocating for a second opinion and to get a different study that is more lenient, that just tells the truth. And the truth is that the cost to update it to renewable energy is one that will save money in the long haul. Not only will it save money, it will save lives. And it is a career booster. It's a career, a lifelong career for Hartford residents. This is a multi-generational fix. And my hope is, and our hope is, that people recognize that this is beyond just a Hartford issue. This is a statewide issue. So I've had people from all over, people from Third Act, who have been on my team, who have been consistent. Like Martha has also been on my team and has been consistent in regards to this fight. So without further ado, I think I'll pass it to Sydney. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sydney, pronouns she, her, and I am so excited to welcome some of our speakers in our webinar tonight. So it is an honor to welcome Dr. Sandra Steingraber to our webinar. Dr. Steingraber is a renowned biologist, author, and environmental advocate. She grew up in Tazewell County, Illinois, alongside industrial agriculture and manufacturing. Her personal experience with bladder cancer during college ignited her research between the connections of environmental toxins and human health. She credits Silent Spring as the reason she transitioned from laboratory work to scientific writing. Her critically acclaimed book, Living Downstream, an ecologist's personal investigation of cancer and the environment, was the first to link U.S. toxic release data with cancer registry statistics. It was later adapted into a powerful documentary to highlight the environmental roots of cancer. She's also written other books, including Having Faith, an ecologist's journey to motherhood, which explores the intimate ecology of motherhood as a memoir of her own pregnancy and investigation of fetal toxicology. Her book, Raising Elijah, Protecting Our Children in an Age of Environmental Crisis, identifies a safe environment as a human rights issue and explores the challenges and solutions to the ongoing chemical contamination of our children and our biosphere. She's also played a leading role in banning fracking in New York State, testified before the European Parliament and U.S. Congress, and briefed United Nations delegates. Her advocacy is founded by the belief that these threats are not only scientific challenges, but also moral and human rights issue. So, wow, please give us a warm welcome to Dr. Sandra Steingraber.
Well, thank you, Sydney. And hi, everyone. I'm Sandra Steingraber, and currently I serve as senior scientist for the Science and Environmental Health Network, which provides good science and legal resources for communities targeted by the oil and gas industry. And tonight, that's all of you. My whole organization, Science and Environmental Health Network, whose link I've thrown up at the top of the chat, stands behind you and is ready to help. We're all 5 of us, a little team of attorneys and scientific researchers. One of our signature projects is the Fracking Science Compendium, which is a 500 and some page encyclopedia of vetted science translated into plain spoken English that is a summary of all of the evidence about the health harms and climate harms of fracking, pipelines, compressor stations, and the whole kind of infrastructural project. So I don't need to speak the details of the science tonight. That link is also available to you in the chat, and it's a fully searchable document. What I want to do tonight is kind of give a bigger picture. And before I dive into that, I want to say that before I took on the oil and gas industry, I was a field biologist. I wrote my dissertation about trees. And I would still be studying photosynthesis, which is the most beautiful thing I know, if the forests weren't all on fire and I didn't feel called to put the fire out. So last week, however, I had the amazing opportunity to re-immerse myself in forests. I'm actually speaking to you tonight from Sacramento, where I've been meeting with some very fine climate activists, and also had the chance to do what I love best, which is hike through forests, along stream beds, on the sides of mountains, and atop bluffs. And I want to tell you what I've seen out here in California's wine country north of San Francisco, which was severely burned in climate-fueled fires more than 4 years ago. I want to tell you that it's still spectacular. The trails are still full of hikers and mountain bikers and horse riders, but it's not the same. Dense forests have become chaparrals, the hillsides are eroding, bluffs are crumbling, miles and miles of dead trees are standing just behind the new growth as a kind of terrible kindling for the next fire. There's no snowmelt pouring into the North Fork of the American River, and there should be. I saw dry stones in the sun that were once submerged stones at the bottom of the riverbed. I know what this landscape used to look like because my hiking partner is a California naturalist who's lived here for 45 years and for whom this is her most beloved ecosystem. But instead of sharing with me the wonder and awe that she has experienced, she had to ask me to imagine what it used to be like before the dense forests burned to skeletal remains and feel the heartbreak and fear that she feels for the future. So we didn't have the sort of John Muir engagement, enjoyment in California's wildlands, but instead that was replaced by a loss of what had been and a trepidation for the future. So I want to ask you now to kind of conjure in your mind's eye your own favorite spot, wherever you live. Maybe it's in New York or New England, a family cabin in the woods, a seaside cottage, a section of the Appalachian Trail that you hike. For me, it's the west shore of Cayuga Lake where I taught my kids how to swim. Now imagine bringing a friend here and having to say, oh, this is where we all went swimming before the toxic algal blooms brought to us by all the heat waves poisoned this lake. Oh, and here was my favorite train ride along the Hudson River between Albany, New York City, before sea level rise swallowed the tracks and ended that. So just keep that picture in your mind's eye as we talk here tonight about what your favorite place is and how you want to commit yourself to defending that. Because our urgent task is to decarbonize as deeply and rapidly as possible. And that starts with a deep commitment to stop any plans to expand oil and gas infrastructure and further entrench a fossil fuel economy. Everything sacred and good depends on our collective victory in doing that task. And that means we have to stop a build out of any more future build out of the more than 300,000 miles of natural gas transmission pipelines that traverse the United States Each one of these lines is serviced every 40 to 100 miles by compressor stations. And these pressurize the gas and keep it push it along and keep it moving. These compressor stations also periodically vent climate-killing methane directly into the atmosphere to prevent explosions. So these compressor stations don't leak because there are plumbing problems. They leak by design and by necessity. Otherwise, the whole thing would just blow up. And these not only destabilize our climate system, but represent a terrible menace to the health in our communities where they're located. And again, I'll refer you to our Fracking Science Compendium. There's a whole chapter on pipelines and compressor stations that will present to you all the peer-reviewed science. In a sentence, we're worried about benzene and formaldehyde, which come pouring out of these compressor stations, along with 70 other air pollutants, 39 of which are cancer-causing substances. I can tell you quickly about a 2020 study that showed proximity to compressor stations leads to increased death rates. So these things are actually killing us. We can say that. There's science for that. A 2021 study from Ohio showed that indoor air inside the homes that are located near compressor stations have high levels of the kind of toxic gases that compressor stations emit. Every natural gas pipeline has an individual name. They have individual permitting decisions. They have backstories and stories about citizen opposition campaigns. They have their own accident reports and lawsuits and owners and investors. So let's just name a few across our nation as a kind of establishing shot here. There's the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which looked absolutely unfeasible until its debt was guaranteed by Duke and Dominion Energy. There's the Albany Loop Pipeline, which was actually killed by citizen opposition. There's the Spectra Pipeline, which exploded and destroyed a house in Pennsylvania in 2016. There's the Revolution Pipeline, which exploded and destroyed a house in Pennsylvania in 2018. There's an Enbridge pipeline that exploded, killed one person, and injured 6 in Kentucky in 2019. There's the $6.2 billion Mountain Valley pipeline, which lost a key water permit in 2021 and looked doomed, but then came roaring back to life in 2023 when a deal between Congress and the White House was struck that required its approval. Then there's the giant Weymouth, Massachusetts Enbridge compressor station, about which there's a whole amazing oppositional story by the citizens there. And I know Frax is on the call tonight, and I hope you'll tell us more in the chat about what's going on in Weymouth. And then there's the Iroquois pipeline, which runs like a scar right through the Hudson Valley where I live now, with compressor stations cited in environmental justice communities. It's also attempting to expand. And then there's the project that brings us all together tonight, the so-called Maple Project. Well, that seems really overwhelming. Just keeping track of all the pipeline names and all the fights and tragedies playing out across multiple states. But what I want to say here is that behind them all, there's just actually one name and one origin story. And that name is Big Inch, like an inch, like 12 inches in a ruler. Big Inch. And the story is war. So, before World War II, all the crude oil that was brought to the East Coast refineries had to come by ship from Texas through the Gulf of Mexico and around Florida and into the East Coast. But in 1942, German U-boats patrolling the US coastline prevented those ships from moving. And so in great haste, all the US oil majors brought together by our federal government formed one corporation backed by public financing, and in haste and secrecy created two 1,000-mile pipelines connecting Texas oil fields up to refineries in the Northeast. The industry could not have afforded to build these pipelines. All the steel that they required for high-pressure pipeline to move that much oil would have been impossible without federal financing. But the Big Inch 24-inch diameter pipeline connected New York, New Jersey, and Philadelphia with Texas. It crossed 37 rivers and 200 creeks and lakes. It was built with great haste and secrecy and victory after the war. It was considered heroic in the effort to stop the war, but suddenly it became a piece of junk. It wasn't needed. It was all slated to be auctioned off as war surplus. It needed to be disposed of. But then in 1946, a big coal strike made coal unavailable and scarce in the Northeast. So this pipeline was repurposed with natural gas in order to break a union strike. That's why we're in the situation we are now, because of a labor issue in 1946. That became the Tesco pipeline, Texas Eastern Pipeline. Natural gas started flowing to the Northeast, and it's been flowing ever since. It was bought by the Calgary-based Enbridge Corporation, which owns it now, and the Algonquin pipeline is part of that, is part of the Tesco natural gas pipeline, and the Maple project is the expansion of the Algonquin pipeline. So these are just some of the names that we sort of need to understand and the origin story behind them. So in closing here, before we hand this over to my friend Bill, I want to say it's all one pipeline, right? They have these different parts of it have different names, but it was designed to win a war, and then it was repurposed with union busting in mind. It was never created to be the best way to design an energy system for New York and New England. The Enbridge 1,100-mile Algonquin transmission pipeline services New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, and Project Maple seeks to expand that by replacing some of those old pipelines, by adding new pipelines to it, and adding lots more toxic compressor stations. It has an argument that this will allow old heating oil to be replaced with gas, and that is supposed to be good for the climate, but all the new research shows that that's not true. If it ever was true, it's certainly outdated research. As was said at the beginning of this talk tonight, natural gas is just as terrible, if not worse, than coal for the climate, and presents as many problems as heating oil. So advising us to switch from oil to gas is like telling an alcoholic to switch from whiskey to wine instead of going to AA meetings. So what we need to fight all one pipeline is all one movement, a movement of great solidarity where we in the Hudson Valley who are fighting the Iroquois pipeline can work together with you in the Northeast to fight the Maple expansion project, share tactics and strategies, and coordinate. The message needs to be, thanks, Big Pipeline, Big Inch Pipeline, for helping us defeat the Nazis in the 1940s. But now it seems to us you're kind of working with the Nazis these days. And so it's time to retire. And our legacy should not be a 1940s pipeline that served a role of exigency at the time, but rather the legacy should be these favorite landscapes of ours that we seek to preserve, because the climate crisis is not just coming for us as a sort of existential crisis. It's not just a serial killer who's going to take out our children. It's also going to defamiliarize all the places that we know and love the best, and that therefore we stand together across the nation to say no more of these. And there are lots better ideas for how to keep the lights on. So with that, back to the organizers, and thanks so much for making this conversation possible.
Thank you so much, Sandra. That was incredibly insightful and powerful, and just really appreciate everything that you shared. We're actually going to do a couple-minute interlude with another song by a Connecticut artist before we pass it over. So I'm going to share my screen and my sound really quick. And if folks need to take a minute to stretch your legs, and then we'll be right back.
Love the way the flowers smell, but I hate the pollution. Pain fell when the acid fell. We gotta find a solution. They call me crazy when I yell. They don't know what they doing. Frag gas got it hot as hell. Don't spill the ruin. Ozone. We gotta save the ozone. the ozone. No, we can't do this alone. The ozone. We gotta save the ozone. The ozone. No, we can't do this alone. Mother Nature guides me, Sierra right beside me. We marching like an army, I don't really need a Rari. Riding, smoking hybrid, black hoodie, no high bridge. Trayvon got me riding, these politicians lying. Climate change is real, the problem is racism. All I do is feel the product of classism. Can't be solved with pills, I'm hurt by fascism. Ain't taking no deal, I'm screaming, tear down the system. I love the way the flowers smell, but I hate the pollution. Pain fell when the acid fell. We gotta find a solution. They call me crazy when I yell. They don't know what they doing. Frag gas got it hot as hell. Dumps piled the ruin. The ozone. We gotta save the ozone. The ozone. No, we can't do this alone. The ozone. We gotta save the ozone. The ozone. No, we can't do this alone. I love the way the flowers smell, but I hate the pollution. Pain fell when the acid fell. We gotta find a solution. They call me crazy when I yell. They don't know what they doing. Fried gas got it hot as hell. Don't spiral to ruin. The ozone. We gotta save the ozone. The ozone. No, we can't do this alone.
And with that, I will pass it back to Sydney.
Incredible, beautiful song. And now we are honored to welcome Bill McKibben as one of our speakers this evening. Bill McKibben is a trailblazer in the climate movement and an incredible advocate for justice. He is the founder of Third Act, which mobilizes people over 60 for bold action on climate and social justice. Bill's groundbreaking book in 1989, The End of Nature, is regarded as the first book to introduce the general public to the reality of climate change and has been translated into 24 languages. Bill has authored 20 books that appear regularly in periodicals from The New Yorker to Rolling Stone, and has earned numerous awards, including the Right Livelihood Award, sometimes called the Alternate Nobel, and the Gandhi Peace Prize. He's a distinguished scholar in environmental studies at Middlebury College and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Bill is also a founder of 350.org, the first global grassroots climate campaign, and has been involved and influential in movements including opposing fossil fuel pipelines like Keystone XL and the Fossil Fuel Divestment Campaign, which has become the biggest anti-corporation campaign in history, with endowments worth more than $40 trillion stepping back from oil, gas, and coal. Tonight, we are so privileged to learn from Bill's deep wisdom, experience, and commitment to climate justice. His leadership continues to inspire generations of activists to take bold action to protect our planet and oppose fossil fuel expansion projects. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Bill McKibben.
Well, Sydney, thank you so much. What a pleasure to be with you, and what a pleasure to get to follow my old and dear and really wonderful friend, Sandra Steingraber. We've been doing this a long time, friend, and it's always a pleasure. She's in beautiful Sacramento. I'm in the frosty Green Mountains where the snow is starting to come down, though this is going to be, it turns out, the warmest January globally ever. Um, it's been awfully nice. Old school winter here in the Northeast. So to everybody from New England, I hope you are taking absolute full advantage of every flake of snow and every beautiful cold starry night. Don't take any of this wonder for granted because, well, this is as good as it's going to get. Um, I've got just two tasks for you tonight. One of them's boring and the other's more interesting. The first one is just to talk to you for a minute about natural gas and what it is, to take up the story that Sandra was telling. And the reason I do it is not because I don't think that you all already know this, it's because the idea that natural gas somehow represents cleaner energy is so deeply ingrained in so many minds, especially the minds of politicians, that it's just worth reminding ourselves over and over again the truth about it. The reason that we thought it was cleaner was because when you burn it, it produces less carbon dioxide than coal does to generate electricity. That's why people 20 years ago talked about it as a bridge fuel that would get us to the renewable energy world, okay, and do less damage in the process. The problem with that argument, the biggest problem, turned out simply to be chemistry. And it was Sandra's friends in Ithaca at Cornell, particularly Bob Howarth, who really unlocked this story beginning about 15 years ago, maybe a little more. What they demonstrated was that when that methane was leaked, unburned into the atmosphere, molecule for molecule, as people have been saying, it traps far more heat than carbon. And what they showed, and what study after study has showed, is that it leaks inevitably from the whole process. When you frack it, when you put it through a pipeline, when you run it through, as Sandra said, a compressor station, on and on and on. And it leaks in part because it's a gas. It's light. It's trying to get out all the time. That's what gases do. So no surprise that it turns out to be doing at least as much damage as coal. The US has boasted about how it's driven down its carbon emissions over the last 20 years. But since that's almost entirely been accomplished by replacing coal-fired power plants with gas-fired power plants, our total contribution to the destruction of the climate has shifted very little, if at all. That's the thing to keep remembering. Never let anyone tell you that this is the lesser of two evils, that it's not as bad as what was coal or something else. Natural gas, fracked gas, is a global warming machine. It's in America now the biggest component to the destruction of the climate. And of course, it's one that we're busily trying to export abroad. So that's the boring part, the chemistry lesson. Now I'm going to tell you the exciting part. I'm going to tell you a story, and it's actually a story about California, where Sandra is today. California has done more than any other state to really build out its renewable energy resources. And those efforts hit some kind of tipping point in 2023. Mark Jacobson, the wonderful Stanford professor who is responsible for an awful lot of what we know about the possibilities for renewable energy, started in March tweeting out, back when it was still modestly politically acceptable to still use Twitter, started tweeting out a kind of daily recap of how much of California's electricity supply was coming from wind and water and sun. And beginning in March, day after day after day, for long stretches of the day, it was 100% or more suddenly coming from renewable energy, which meant that at night, often, the biggest source of supply to the grid in California was batteries that had been soaking up that excess sunshine all afternoon. Okay. Those batteries didn't even exist on that grid 3 or 4 years ago. This is remarkable proof of something that we've been talking about now for a few years. Proof of the fact that we pretty much all of a sudden, beginning sometime in the early part of this decade, crossed some invisible line where the cost of generating electricity from coal and gas and oil was suddenly higher than the cost of generating it from the sun and the wind. We live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. Even those of us who work in this, who struggle hard all the time to make this change happen, forget, I think, or haven't yet fully internalized this. We talk about sun and wind as alternative energy, as if they were kind of the Whole Foods of energy, a kind of pricey, if nice way to produce power. They are the Costco of energy. They are the cheap stuff available in bulk off the shelf. And here's the bottom line from California for 2024. Because of all that renewable power and those batteries, California in 2024 used 25% less natural gas to produce electricity than it had in 2023. Just think about that number for a minute. The fifth largest economy in the world used in 12 months managed to cut its use of natural gas by 25%. That should give you some clue why the oil and gas industry spent $455 million electing the new administration this past year. They are terrified because they know that there is now a better alternative than their product for producing the same thing, energy. That natural gas is not as cheap and certainly not as clean as producing renewable energy and then running it through a heat pump to heat your house instead of the gas-fired furnace in the basement. It's far better in health terms to use that renewable electricity to run an induction cooktop in your kitchen instead of the essentially open campfire you have there now. And Sandra can give you the numbers on what percentage of asthma cases in this country are directly linked to just growing up in a house with a gas-fired stove in the kitchen. It's high because there's all those particulates pouring out into young and vulnerable lungs. So the reason that they are fighting so hard to build these pipelines now is, I think the key word here is lock in, all right? They are desperate to get the infrastructure locked in so that people will remain dependent on dirty and expensive energy for another 30, 40, 50 years, whatever the life of these pipelines and compressor stations and things is designed to be. They're desperate to prevent Connecticut and Massachusetts and New York and every place else from doing what California did, which is radically change its energy system in the matter of a few years to deal with the climate crisis that is destroying us. And so our job, in part, is simply to prevent that lock-in, to make it hard for them to build these things, to do all the things that we can do, every challenge, every political obstacle, every legal case, every enlightened politician that we can find. Because past a certain point, not very far in the future, nobody is going to be willing to invest in this kind of infrastructure. It's going to become so patently clear just how much cheaper and saner it is to rely on the sun and the wind. So along with the job of fighting pipelines, the other half of this work is promoting the things that make them unnecessary everywhere. producing more Californias as fast as we can. And there's no reason that the states of the Northeast can't be just as renewable as the state of California. We don't have the Mojave Desert, but they don't have the great offshore wind resources or onshore wind resources that we have in the Northeast. I can tell you, it was windy out there today when I was out in the woods. And so one of the things that we're doing at Third Act with lots and lots of partners, we haven't officially announced this yet, but I just want you to circle the date on your calendar so you don't get engaged in some other activity on the autumnal equinox, weekend of September 20th and 21st, we're going to do a big global day of action, and we're going to call it Sun Day. And we are going to celebrate the power of the sun, the liberating idea that we no longer need to depend on people who have hoarded reserves of gas and oil, that we can get our energy from heaven and not from hell. Um, and that is a profoundly different idea, an idea that no longer concentrates power in the hands of a few companies and a few oligarchs who happen to control those deposits of energy, because we all have sun and we all have wind and we all can use it. We just need to get to work. We need to change some laws. Last year in Germany, apartment dwellers installed in 1.5 million German apartments what they call balcony solar. They just hung a solar panel off the banister, the railing of their balcony. And in many cases, were able to produce 20% of the energy that their home used just from that one solar panel. You can't do that in this country. It's essentially illegal. You need 9 kinds of building permits. It takes forever and gets too expensive. We need to change those laws. We need to make it really possible for people everywhere to access what we need, energy that comes cleanly. And if we do, then the next generation of pipeline activists will have an easier fight, because it will no longer make even the slightest kind of economic sense to invest in this sort of thing. That's why we need to move on all fronts now. And that's why it is so wonderful to see how many groups have rallied and how successfully and how powerfully. I really, really love watching I first learned about the Maple Project from third actors in Massachusetts. And to have these sort of early warning networks of good activists now out around the country who know what's going on, young and old, is something really, really powerful. As I say, we at Third Act are indeed old, and nonetheless steadfast and resolute, and we will stand with and behind all the people doing all kinds of good work here. I look forward to it very much. Look forward to the day when we no longer even have to talk about chemistry anymore, because we're instead just moving electrons around, taking full advantage of the fact that the good Lord was kind enough to hang a large ball of fiery gas 93 million miles up in the sky, and now we know how to take full advantage of it. So thank you all enormously for all that you're doing.
Thank you so much for everything that you shared tonight and for all of your work more broadly. I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say I really greatly appreciate it. Before we move into questions for tonight, we are just going to do a little bit of a call to action, and I want to first introduce myself to you all. My name is Sana Wazer. I am a climate activist from Connecticut and a member of the Stop Project Maple Coalition, as well as a master's student at Yale School of the Environment. And before we move into questions, like I said, I want to just take a few minutes to talk about ways to take action following this webinar. And I know folks have been asking a little bit about that in the chat, so excited to hopefully answer some of those questions. Because we're so incredibly grateful that so many of you chose to spend your Tuesday night with the Stop Project Maple Coalition, and we hope that you will continue to engage with our work moving forward. So with that, we have a number of ways for folks to plug into the coalition and to fight back against Project Maple. So first, we have two upcoming events that I'm really excited to share with you. And I'm actually going to drop a whole bunch of links in the chat before I go through them so I can keep stuff separate. And Sydney's going to go ahead and share her screen so you can take a look at our website as well, which has all of these. But the first event that we have coming up is on Tuesday, February 11th at 3 p.m. in Hartford, Connecticut. And at this event, we will be rallying outside of the Eversource headquarters for climate action and affordable energy. Because Eversource is the electric utility for most of Connecticut, it also serves parts of Massachusetts and New Hampshire. But unfortunately, they also tie our states to fossil fuels, including Project Maple. Eversource Massachusetts publicly stated their interest in buying additional gas from the Project Maple expansion. And they also consistently raise rates, which disproportionately impact low-income ratepayers, all while spreading misinformation and bullying legislators. And so on February 11th, we will rally to call out these actions, and we would love to have all of you join us to make the most powerful statement possible at that action. Following the rally, and also for folks who might not be close enough to join us in Hartford, we will be hosting a letter to the editor writing workshop on Thursday, February 20th at 5 p.m. And at that workshop, we will talk about the power of letters to the editor as a means to communicate with both elected officials and your community. And we'll frame this specifically through the Project Maple expansion and also help you get started on writing your own. Beyond that, though, beyond those two specific events, I want to invite you all to sign and share with 5 friends or more, ideally, the petition for your state demanding that Project Maple be stopped. The petitions are all linked on our website, and they will go to specific people for your state. You can also join the Stop Project Maple Coalition if you're interested in becoming more involved on a regular basis with a fight or with our fight to stop this massive expansion. We have over 100 organizations and advocates and activists involved currently from across the region who are impacted by this project. And finally, please check out our Stop Project Maple Instagram and our social media guide if you're interested in sharing our work and engaging through that avenue. I've dropped the links in the chat. I will share them again, but we'll also follow up with all of this information via email if you weren't able to grab it tonight. Beyond that, no matter what you do, I am asking you to take action beyond tonight's webinar. Project Maple runs directly through my hometown, about a quarter mile from my parents' house and the farm that I grew up on. Stopping this expansion is deeply personal to me. It's about fighting for my community and the future that I want. And I'm committed to seeing our states move towards a future that is clean and green, where our energy comes from sources like the wind and sun and heat from the earth, rather than toxic pipelines that poison our air, water, and communities. I don't want to worry about pipeline leaks and explosions or a climate that is becoming increasingly hostile. So I'm asking you to take action, to join our work, and to sustain your involvement in this pipeline fight and the fight for climate action more broadly. So thank you all again for coming tonight, and I will pass it over to Martha to facilitate questions.
Thank you so much, Senna. And thank you so much, Bill and Sandra, and Alicia and Nick and Sydney and everyone. Wonderful. So we have so many questions, so I kind of think I need to go backwards and I think this first one is actually going to be for Bill, but Sandra may have something to comment on. So one thing that we've heard about, just shifting gears away from methane for half a second, is that, the same companies that make piles of profit off fossil fuels, love nuclear, another dreadfully expensive form of power that we have such better alternatives to. So we've heard our Governor Lamont, where, we have a really big power plant here that powers about 40% of Connecticut's energy, but also about 25% of the rest of New England. And they're constantly beating the drum to get more power, even though a lot of that is probably in fact for data centers. But Bill, and maybe Sandra, do you want to comment on the drum beating for more nukes, more nuke power?
I'll just say I don't think it's in the end going to amount to much. And I think the single biggest reason it's not going to amount to much is it's incredibly expensive. We can now produce energy from the sun and the wind for a few pennies a kilowatt hour. And we can build it in the course of a few months instead of the incredibly expensive and unbelievably time-consuming job of building nuclear power plants. Um, um, the the data center thing is the kind of perfect example. Um, Everybody's using that as their rationale for why we're going to start building more and more of everything. Natural, the gas guys love it, the nuclear guys love it, whatever. Well, the first thing is a lot of that got kicked in the rear end yesterday by this team of 20 young Chinese who released their own AI model that they built for $6 million and it runs on your computer instead of up in the cloud. Um, um, it was no surprise that not only did NVIDIA's stock drop like a rock, so did a lot of the energy and utility stocks because people know that we're not going to need that kind of energy. Um, but even to the degree that we're going to be building data centers, there was a terrific report by a bunch of people out of Silicon Valley, headed by the climate scientist Zeke Hausfather in December, that demonstrated that if you're going to do data centers, the way to power them, cheapest, quickest, most obvious, and probably only really even possible way is to co-locate them next to dedicated solar parks, as it were. Um, and they had all the specs about how you would do it, and that there was plenty of places and plenty of power. And my guess is that's where that will flow. It's really worth remembering that not only is the science, I spared you guys from my usual talk about climate change tonight. Suffice it to say, we're in a difficult place, and things are really bad. All of you who watched the fires in LA, which burned down the boyhood home where I have my first memories, um, all of you who are well aware of what's going on. Um, but it's not just that. It's that now the reason I didn't talk so much about that is because the thing I really want you to understand is that economic gravity is now working in our favor. The economic winds are at our backs. That's very different from how the first 20 years of the climate movement went, when the job was to try and slow down the endless expansion of the fossil fuel industry, even though they had the economic argument that they had cheap fossil fuel. What they've got is expensive fossil fuel. And therefore, I don't think that we're going to see a huge amount of nuclear build out anywhere.
I think that's right, Bill. I would just say that it remains a kind of threat. Nevertheless, especially in New York, I feel like there are forces that will do anything to make sure that renewables don't suddenly take the center stage. But I want to invite Nancy Van, who I know is on the call, to put some things in the chat. She's a leading anti-nuclear activist in New York State, an attorney who's been fighting the reopening of Indian Point and other things. And she just is a national treasure and a wealth of information. So Nancy, if you want to throw a few links in the chat for those who want to follow up on that, I think that would be deeply welcomed.
Thank you. Thank you. And just one more thing, going back to nuclear for a second, with your expertise, Sandra, there are people that seem to think that nuclear waste is somehow less in volume or less lethal and carcinogenic than, waste possibly from construction of other renewable things like solar, where there are certainly heavy metals involved in that. But I don't know I'm not sure if there's any science to support that whatsoever, but I don't know if you want to comment to that.
Well, I mean, radiation is the kind of the original, the OG of carcinogens, and so we've never figured out a way to safely contain it, a world without end, amen, for all of eternity, and so that remains its fatal flaw from a public health point of view. That's certainly true.
That's excellent. Thank you. Yes, that sounds right. There's a question for Connecticut people, and maybe, I don't know if Sam D can maybe answer this, but does Connecticut's Clean Air Act have any impact on the pipeline plans? And I'm going to respond that it really doesn't, not directly, but what it indirectly does is it loosened up a little bit of the caps that our state put on solar. I didn't have time in my brief intro to talk about how Connecticut doesn't just foster methane development, it capped the development of solar. So, Sam, do you want to say anything more about the Connecticut, most recent Connecticut Clean Air Act?
Yeah, I would agree. It does not have impact on the pipeline plans. Unfortunately, our state goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and our state goals for 100% zero carbon electricity by 2040 don't seem to be factored in to permit decisions that are happening at the state agencies.
Mm-hmm. Right. Here's a good question. They're all good questions. People being worried about putting solar panels on farmland and in forests. And I'm going to ask maybe Bill and Sandra both might have thoughts on that. But what I want to say is that in Connecticut, that's been set up as a real false debate. Our state has so invested so much in frac gas development, really didn't make any investment for solar, and in fact has capitated solar for municipal, resident, and business, although the caps have been somewhat liberalized. And it turns out the cheapest way for solar development in Connecticut was just to cut down forests or get somebody to sell you farmland. So it really wasn't, it's a false argument, I think, in our state. I think that we can simultaneously protect forests and incentivize rooftop solar. Sandra and Bill, do you guys have thoughts on that?
I'll make what might be a slightly controversial argument that there are cases where it makes a lot of sense to put solar not just on rooftops and parking lot canopies, but also on land that we're currently using for industrial agriculture. Um, you know, um, we don't need a huge amount of land to produce renewable energy, but we need some. The best guess, again, from Mark Jacobson, is something like 1.7% of the country. 30 million acres, which is actually just about the same number of acres that we use to grow corn that gets turned into ethanol. I live in a corn growing county here, Addison County in Vermont, where we have plans for a 200-acre solar farm on land that's currently growing corn. And so I've thought about this a good deal. And the way that I think about it is a cornfield is another form of solar collector. It's just a really inefficient one because you can get about 100 times more miles in a car if you put the same acreage under solar panels as you would growing ethanol and sticking it in a car. And it's also a solar collector that you have to pour huge amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus on every year in order to make it grow. In the case of Vermont, that washes into Lake Champlain, and that's what causes our biggest algal blooms and things. But in the case of the US as a whole, that nitrogen and phosphorus you poured on all that ethanol is washing straight down the Mississippi River into what I'm going to continue to call the Gulf of Mexico, President Trump be darned, where it produces a dead zone the size of New Jersey. So I think that there are actually powerful arguments for using some small percentage of the flat land in this country for producing a crop that we very badly need, and that crop is clean electrons. So I've got solar panels all over my roof, and I'm really happy that I do, but it turns out that there aren't enough roofs in America facing the sun to get all the power that we need. We're going to need some other land too, and I think that's okay.
Well, I think this is where alternative analysis is really important. And so if, and also where an environmental justice argument really helps us put this in perspective. You can't build out more pipelines, or in the case of the Iroquois pipeline project, double the amount of gas, fracked gas flowing through pre-existing pipelines without building more compressor stations. Compressor stations are some of the most toxic pieces of industrial junk that are on our landscape. Their stacks are close to the ground at sort of human lung height. They're not high smokestacks in the air. And again, they vent benzene, they vent formaldehyde. Those are two carcinogens. And then 39 other carcinogens and 70 hazardous air pollutants in total. Those all have to go between 40 and 100 miles along a pipeline. Okay, where are you going to put those? And the answer is they put them in poor and non-white communities. In the case of the Iroquois pipeline, which I know best, one of the compressor stations is sited very near a grade school in the environmental justice community of Athens, which is right across the river from where I live in Hudson. And also there are compressor stations planned for Dover. And so it's not okay to treat the communities of Black, brown, indigenous, and low income as the human sacrifices to make the fossil fuel gas flow through a pipeline. And if you don't want solar panels in farm fields, then that's what you're going to get. So this isn't a fantasy game. This is like choose, which is more or less harmful. And you can't expand a pipeline without hurting people.
Excellent. Yes. Thank you. Brilliant. Sandra, let me direct this question to you first, and then maybe Bill. It came up in the chat that we're talking about pipelines that are getting left in the ground. So when they do these expansions, they put in a new pipeline. They don't actually expand an old pipeline, and they tend to cap it and leave it in place. And so people have questions about this so-called capping and abandoning of pipelines. And I think there's quite a bit of toxicity that could be related to that. Is that right, Sandra?
Wow, I actually don't know the answer to that. I've never looked at those data. Yeah, it's definitely the case that the pipelines, as the gas is full of different impurities. So when we talk about natural gas, I guess we should say this. Bill gave a great chemistry lesson. I appreciated that. So natural gas is mostly methane, which is, a carbon with a bunch of hydrogens around it. But it contains natural gas is a host of other things too, which is why the end of the natural gas pipeline, if it's your gas stove or your furnace, is not just pouring methane into your indoor home, but it's pouring all these other hydrocarbons as well, even when it's turned off. And so those things also build up inside pipelines, which is why they have to undergo what's called pigging operations, which involves putting like a giant bullet and shooting it through the pipeline, which scrapes the sides of the pipeline. This is why they have these blowdowns and venting events that are sort of built into the engineering of the compressor station pipeline system. And you can ask the people about Weymouth, Massachusetts, another environmental justice community full of immigrant and low-income people who live right next to this giant compressor station. And so that is absolutely damaging to our air quality and damaging to public health. So presumably all of those same chemicals are lining the inside of these abandoned pipelines. I don't actually know what the fate of them is. But the other way, I guess I should say, to expand a pipeline is what they're doing in New York State, which is to just double the amount of gas going through these aging pre-existing pipelines. And then, of course, you're raising risks in that case. You're not building new pipeline, but you're raising the risk for accidents. And you also, even though there's not new pipelines, there's got to be new compressor stations to provide the pressure.
And I'll just add
that's what I know.
that back at the other end of the pipeline, there are now millions of abandoned oil and gas wells across this country that are spewing lots and lots of stuff into the atmosphere all the time. And these are mostly abandoned by the companies that drilled them, and the states where they're located increasingly just let them get away with it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Excellent. All right. I think I may have read most of the questions, but a couple things I want to say about in the chat. People are dropping in really brilliant links, and thank you. And I'm sure Senna will capture this stuff and make sure that it gets shared when this recording goes out to everybody, along with the call to action. And Ellen, thank you for sharing stuff about the dangers, hazards of radiation relating to the conversation about nuclear. And the other thing that's coming up in the chat is people are saying, well, I'm in New York, I'm in Mass, how do I click in or get involved? So Stop Project Maple encompasses not just Sierra Club Mass is there in the chat, Food and Water Watch, other groups, and Ellen put in a link, or other, the group of Nancy Vans, as well as other groups in New York, and they're working with Stop Project Maple as well. So, and then you can, of course, sign up at Stop Project Maple, which Senna put that in the call to action. So if anybody feels like you're not hooked in, please sign your name up and we will find a way to get you hooked in. We want to, as Senna already made the point, we definitely want to move people from thinking and caring deeply, which I know you all already do, to doing action. And, we can do this thing doing it together. I guess there was a question, but about Jacobson. Okay, well, someone's making a point that does sort of relate to what Bill is saying. This is because it's from Bill McKibben's blog. Sorry. Lots of farmers love solar power. Clean energy development, solar and wind represent a financial lifeline to
Let me
diversify incomes, keep farms in the families.
let
And
me
yeah,
just add one more thing to that, so we can end on a sweet note. The best field trip I took last year, and I've just been writing about it in this book of mine that'll be out in August. Best field trip I took this year was with a couple of friends in Vermont who, on solar farms across the state, have been in charge of planting pollinator-friendly plantings between the rows. And the results have been unbelievable. The number of native pollinators jumps by a factor of 10 once they get this done. A cornfield doused in pesticide has essentially no pollinators on it. Now these solar farms, the orchards next to them, the farmers are reporting that fruit set goes up 30 and 40% because there's wasps and bees everywhere. It's truly remarkable to see. The problems that we face are not beyond our ability to solve. We just have to break out of the paradigms that we have been working under for a long time. And the fossil fuel monopoly on our politics is going to make that hard, but not impossible. And I'll just say one more time, don't despair. If we can hold these things off for a few more years, then economics will be an extraordinary help in getting done what it needs doing.
thank you, Bill. Sandra, do you have any final thoughts for us? Oh, I guess we may have a couple. Yeah, please. And then we may have a couple of questions, which we might have time for just a couple.
Well, one of the things I like to remind myself of from time to time when I feel like I'm giving into despair is that I wear my adoptive father's name, Bill Steingraber, fairly proudly. He was a son of German immigrants who was sent off to fight Hitler's army at age 18 and came back pretty messed up by PTSD, but felt that he had participated in something that really mattered. And he did. And the lesson I learned from him, my adoptive father, was to not be a good German. That if there's an injustice that needs fighting, you don't sit on the sidelines and decide if this is winnable. You just go do it. And so I think about that a lot whenever I have to write my name. And I'm sure all of you on this call have things in your past, places that are dear to you, people who you know or who are your ancestors who are intensely courageous in times when they were fighting against all odds. And it's good to feel a sense of courage from that and to realize that we're all kind of members of a great human orchestra. It's really now it's time to play the Save the World Symphony. You don't have to know where the music is going, but you have to know what instrument you hold and play it as well as you can. So wherever you live along the Great Pipeline, you can become a member of the movement opposing the one big old pipeline that has served its purpose, and it's time to retire this thing now. That's our task.
Brava. And also other groups to join. XR is also part of our coalition. There's a bunch of different people in XR. So Alicia and then Bob, and that might be the only questions we have time for, but let's see. Go ahead, Alicia.
I don't have a question. I just have a statement to also continue to end on a good note. Um, I host coffee hours in Hartford at Story and Soil, which is a local coffee shop across the street from Capital Area System. So if anyone would have like to have join me for coffee hour there, that'd be great. I put the link to the events page for Sierra Club Connecticut inside of the chat. So yeah.
Thanks, Alicia. Yep, we'll see you there. And Bob, quick question.
Yeah, well, more of a comment on solar here in Bloomfield. There's a certain amount of resistance to solar that is when it comes to putting it on fields that people are concerned about taking up farmland, and often it's at the initiative of farmers, and they don't want to farm it and they don't want to sell it for development. So solar is a way of getting some income from it. And the other item is now that we're getting more and more solar, there is a need for big battery storage, and that people don't like that in their backyard either.
Yeah.
You need a new aesthetic for a new age. You got to learn to look up at those wind turbines and enjoy the sight of the breeze turning them majestically, and think a little bit about the responsibility that goes with that. We got to look at the sun and think, man, it's pretty remarkable that that thing that already provides us with light and with warmth and with photosynthesis is willing to also provide us with all the power that we need. I see someone asking about the date for Sunday. It's the weekend of September 20th and 21st. I've got to jump here, but I'm just so grateful to everybody for being a part of all of this, and so many thanks. On we go, and I'll just end by saying, we win a bunch of these fights. A bunch of you were there at the beginning of the fight over the Keystone Pipeline when people said we had not the slightest chance in the world. Donald Trump announced last week that he was going to restart the Keystone Pipeline. Good luck, buddy, because that one's not happening, because too many people got in the way for too long. It was really powerful, and on we go.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much. We'll stay and take a few more comments. So Pamela?
Could we get some committees to do things like go and talk to the fire chief in my town who thinks that batteries inside garages and things are too dangerous and is stopping the development of green infrastructure that way? We need to spread the knowledge of to counter the FUD, like with posses or something.
Yep, you'd kind of do have to build up a posse. Rose?
Am I unmuted now? Yeah. One thing to keep in mind if you get pushback on batteries is there are a lot of different technologies coming online now. There's lithium ion with phosphorus added, which is less likely to have thermal runaway. Thermal runaway on big battery storage is dropping like a stone, so they're getting safer and safer. But on top of that, there's iron flow batteries that are non-toxic and don't erupt into flame and last many hours longer. And Form Energy has iron air batteries that are also non-toxic and can supply power for up to 10 days. So there's lots of good technology out there. We have info at nofretgasinmass.com if you want to look that up or shoot us a message. We're looking into it all the time.